ask you, were you able to get your paper? Why was your paper printed in London rather than the U.S.?
It was originally commissioned by the Atlantic Monthly, and after we had published it or written it for them and sent it to them and done a number of revisions in consultation with them, they chose not to publish it. Didn't give us a particularly detailed explanation for why. We looked around a little bit for other possible venues in the United States and ultimately concluded we couldn't publish it here in the United States. It then sort of lay on our shelves for about 6 months when we were then contacted by the London Review of Books, and they were interested in publishing it. So we worked with them, and they brought it out a few months later.
That's interesting. I've noticed a number of opinion pieces on it, but has it been covered much in the news section of newspapers?
It's received some coverage, not very extensive coverage, but in a number of places. The Boston Globe ran a story or two about it. The Washington Post did. What's interesting is most of the news coverage has tended to focus more on the personalities and sort of the controversy, and rather than on the substance of what we actually wrote, which is unfortunate. We would rather that the attention be paid to our arguments than to the individuals who wrote them.
I've noticed that, for example, the Washington Post op-ed, I believe, it seemed to me tried to link you somehow to David Duke.
This has been a pretty common tactic, trying to smear us by linking us with people whose views we find abhorrent. My general view is that when people don't have good counter-arguments to make, then they tend to go for the mud instead and try and smear you. It's unfortunate, but that's all too common when this subject gets raised.
How serious is the situation, do you feel?
I think the situation is quite serious. What's happening in the Middle East now is terrible for all of the peoples in the region. It's very harmful to U.S. interests. It affects the interests of countries around the world. And John and my co-author and I both believe that the United States is not going to have an intelligent Middle East policy if we can't have a rather open and serious debate on all of the forces that shape our conduct in the region and what our interests really are. That's what we're trying to do by doing this research and by publicizing it.
Thanks very much. I guess one last question. I have children. I worry about, I think there's a significant threat to Americans. Do you feel that that's the case?
Well, I have children too, and I think all parents worry a lot about their children and worry about the world they're leaving for them. I think the United States does face a number of problems, and a number of the security problems we face are partly of our own making. So yes, I take those interests seriously. That's why I do what I do.
Professor, when you first came out with the study, with the paper, the Harvard paper, or the lobby, Israel lobby, a lot of pressure, a lot of negative reaction, I think you had to go through as a result of this paper. Can you talk about this and what makes you come out and talk about it now?
Well, we fully anticipated that when we wrote the piece that we would be hammered really hard by forces in the lobby, and that they would call us all sorts of terrible names, especially anti-Semitic. We didn't know that we would be identified with David Duke, who is clearly a racist and who we don't associate with in any way, but that happened. And again, we expected that sort of thing. We've continued to talk out on it because it is a very important issue. I like to say that if you look at American foreign policy today, the Middle East is the centerpiece of our foreign policy. And if you look at the Middle East, inside the Middle East, Israel is the centerpiece of our foreign policy. So not understanding U.S.-Israeli relations makes it almost impossible to understand overall American foreign policy. So I think we're dealing with a very important issue. And of course, we're dealing with a very important issue that most people are unwilling to talk about in a candid fashion.
It's like you broke a taboo with your study, talking about the influence of the Israeli lobby. Do you think maybe your study will be a leading model, will play a leading role in studies that will follow, that come up with similar conclusions?
I think there's no question that we broke a taboo. The fact that two mainstream academics, one from the University of Chicago and the other from Harvard, were willing to talk about the Israel lobby in very candid terms was something that was almost unthinkable in the United States. I think many people were just shocked that we would do this. So there's no question that we broke a taboo. What the consequences of it all will be is very difficult to say. Lobby is very powerful, and we're just two individuals, and it's not clear that over the long term that we'll have that much effect. Although there is a lot of evidence that we've opened up a space for discussing this issue, and that was our principal goal, just to get the issue out in the open and to get people talking. And I think we've gone some way towards accomplishing that. But how much, we'll have to wait a few years to determine.
I'm wondering, the situation today as a result of the not very well understood policy concerning Israel has become increasingly serious, it seems to me. How dangerous or serious do you feel the U.S. situation is now due to the policies that we have in the Middle East? How dangerous a situation is it for the American public?
Well, we have three goals in the Middle East. First of all, we're interested in combating terrorism, especially dealing with Al-Qaeda. Second, we're interested in dealing with the so-called rogue states like Iran and Syria. And there, we're especially interested in getting Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons program. And third, we're fighting what appears to be a losing war in Iraq, and we're very interested in making sure that we don't lose that war. I think that the recent war in Lebanon damaged us with regard to all three of those goals. I think it's going to make our terrorism problem worse because it's inflamed anti-Americanism. It's increased the number of people who are willing to die to kill Americans. It's created greater sympathy for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. And with regard to dealing with rogue states, if anything, we've driven the Syrians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah closer together. Syria and Iran are likely to continue supporting Hezbollah, and moreover, Iran will probably continue to pursue nuclear weapons. They'd be foolish not to, given the way the United States has been behaving and talking about Iran itself. And then finally, we didn't make the war in Iraq any better. Iraq, as you well know, is dominated by Shia, and those Shia in Iraq, including the ruling elites, are deeply committed, or at least have a powerful sense of allegiance to the Shia who comprise Hezbollah. So, if anything, we've angered our allies in Iraq, and that's certainly not going to make a bad situation better.
One more question, since you have, of course, gotten quite a bit of challenge and attack, etc., for writing this article. Could you describe to me what are your principles, your philosophy? I understand you have some connection to West Point. Do you consider yourself patriotic, moral, etc.?
Well, I think there are few Americans and few scholars who would not deny that they're patriotic or not deny that they're moral. I mean, what got us interested in this whole issue was that after 9/11, it became clear that something was amiss with American policy in the Middle East, and we began to investigate the issue, and it quickly became apparent to us that the U.S.-Israeli relationship was a big part of the problem. So we decided that we would write on the subject because hardly anybody else was willing to do that. In fact, nobody else was really willing to do that. And we wrote the piece.
Thank you.
How relevant is the clean break memorandum today?
Well, I think the Clean Break Memorandum is relevant in the sense that the basic blueprint that Richard Perle, David Wormser, and others laid out for Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996 bears a striking resemblance to the regional transformation strategy that the Bush administration incorporated into its doctrine after 9/11. I wouldn't say, there's 100% overlap, but there's probably about a 95% overlap between the Clean Break study and the Bush doctrine.